Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're just waiting a couple more minutes now. There's still people coming into the Zoom. We'll kick off in a couple of minutes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll make a start. We still have a number of participants coming in, but in an endeavor to get started in a timely fashion. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Christina Golter, and on behalf of my fellow directors of the Sir Michael Howard Centre at King's, I welcome you to this annual lecture this year given by Sir Hew Strachan. I think it's very fitting that this year marks the 60th anniversary of the founding of the War Studies Department by Sir Michael. I should say that this lecture is being live streamed, and you can also follow on Twitter. And please also look for updates on the Sir Michael Howard Centre newsletter. If we happen to have connectivity problems this evening, we have got a pre-recorded version of Sir Hew's lecture, and we'll switch to that if we find that he's pixelating. That's always a danger. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in Margaret Macmillan's latest book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us, she made the point that the long peace that we've enjoyed largely, I would say, since the end of the Second World War has dulled our interest in studying war. And Clausewitz, of course, made very similar observations, and he felt that his contemporaries were getting far too complacent. The often quoted line, "The world is a dangerous place. Do not blunt your sword too much, as someone will come along with a sharp sword and hack off your arms." Well, Sir Michael Howard understood this only too well through his experience in the Italian campaign during World War II. And I think what Sir Hew is doing is to implore us to resuscitate interest in Clausewitz. And with the recent passing of both Sir Michael and Peter Paret, whose edition of Clausewitz, of course, we all tend to use, I think there is a danger of Clausewitz being seen as rather old-fashioned. Nothing could be further from the truth. War is war. And it doesn't matter how many times we read Clausewitz, there are always gems to be found and repolished and treasured all over again. Sir Hew has been a major influence on the discipline of military history, not least his work in 2007 about Clausewitz. His other work spans everything from the Napoleonic era right through to his reflections on the most recent Iraq war, and that has had enormous traction in the right places. So what we can say is that Sir Hew's military history canvas has been absolutely enormous. And this is why his reflections are so important. Sir Hew is currently the Bishop Wardlaw Professor in the School of International Relations at St Andrews University. He's joining us now from home. He'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will turn it over to the Q&A session. And if you could please just hold off until Sir Hew has finished before you start logging your questions. Thank you very much. With that, over to you, Sir Hew. Thank you very much.
Christine, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I'm very conscious that this is the first Michael Howard lecture to be delivered since Michael Howard's death, almost exactly a year ago on the 30th of November 2019, one day after his 97th birthday. For military historians of my generation, he was a constant presence, redefining the subject, sometimes abrupt if he disagreed with you, but a compassionate mentor and a deeply empathetic correspondent and friend. The need to pair Michael Howard, the great student of war of the second half of the 20th century, with Karl von Clausewitz, author of the best known work on war ever written, was compounded by the news, as Christine has just said, of a second death 2 months ago, that of Peter Paret, at the age of 96. Peter Paret was Michael Howard's partner in the 1976 edition and translation of Clausewitz's On War. Let me be clear, this lecture is not about Michael Howard's understanding of Clausewitz, but Peter Paret's. But there are moments when the two are not easily separated. Paret's PhD thesis, published as York and the Era of Prussian Reform, 1807 to 1815, was trailblazing in its unification of military with intellectual and political history. It was a true inspiration to, I remember, the Department of War Studies at Sandhurst when I was there in the late 1970s. It was supervised here at King's by Michael Howard, but Michael himself said in his memoirs that it would have been impertinent to describe himself as Paret's supervisor, so much did he learn from him. Peter Paret similarly acknowledged Michael's influence, saying that Howard had first introduced him to the study of war in the framework of intellectual, social, and political history. Michael Howard first read Clausewitz in 1953, presumably, but I don't know, in the J.J. Graham translation, which first came out in 1873 and was reissued in 1908. In 1962, Peter Paret persuaded Princeton University Press to undertake a translation into English of all Clausewitz's works. So much for the ambitions of youth. Extraordinarily, there is no full scholarly edition of all Clausewitz's works in his native language. So unsurprisingly, we're still awaiting their English edition. And until very recently, remarkably little of Clausewitz's other output, massive output beyond on war had been translated into English. In 1964, 2 years later, Paret was instrumental in convening a conference in Berlin to divvy up the work involved in this massive project. Howard and Paret undertook to contribute and edit the translation of On War. This was to be based on the original first edition of Vom Kriege, published between 1832 and 1834, and revised as the 16th German edition in 1952 by Werner Hallweg, who was himself at the Berlin Conference. Howard and Paret kept their side of the bargain. Michael Howard wrote in Captain Professor, his memoir, that the task was the most rewarding work, intellectually as well as financially, that I have ever undertaken. Intellectually, it made me realize what a superb training for a historian it is to edit a text, to live in intimate contact with a great mind, place what he wrote in context, and try to express his meaning in terms that make sense for one's own generation. In the age before email, and even before faxes, joint working across the Atlantic was not easy. Michael was not helped by All Souls, where he was then established as a fellow, because the college failed to elect Paret to a visiting fellowship so that they could progress the work. They seem only to have met twice in the ensuing decade. Peter Paret, at least twice in person. Peter Paret came to London for one summer, and Michael Howard reciprocated with a week at Stanford. Importantly, although they did the editing, they did not do all the translation. That was initially undertaken by Angus Malcolm, a retired diplomat, who had already translated Karl Demeter's History of the German Officer Corps. However, Malcolm died in 1970 before the work was completed, a factor which needs to be borne in mind given what Michael himself said about the translation. Michael Howard was a great stylist, a man who took pride and care in his powers of expression, both on the page and in the spoken word. He wanted the English text to flow, even if it does not always do so in the original German. Clausewitz could write extraordinarily expressively, and Christina's just given us an example in that introduction, the way in which he described battle in Book 4 of On War, both vivid and also at times ironic. But he could also write with Teutonic obscurity, where lengthy sentences seem to lack a subject and whose clauses have too many verbs in the passive tense. Many of my German students have preferred to read Howard and Paret's On War than the early 19th century German prose of Vom Kriege. Michael Howard put Clausewitz into English that was colloquial and accessible. Peter Paret himself said all translation is in the end interpretation. But Michael at times went further, likening himself to an impressionist painter. Several scholars, including especially Jan Willem Honig, have written persuasively of the liberties which they took with the translation in order to give it contemporary resonance. Clausewitz was not consistent in his use of vocabulary, as Howard and Paret acknowledged. But they were not consistent either in the English words they employed to translate the German into English. They regularly rendered Krieg, for example, as campaign rather than war, if it suited how they wanted that section of the text to be treated. They also translated Handeln as operations, so inserting a contemporary concept, that of the operational level of war, in a text in which it is absent. And they added adjectives like political in order to gloss the meaning of the words where they thought it appropriate. In 1976, when the book was published, it was a triumph. I remember I was at Cambridge at the time, and I was told that copies had arrived at Heifers, rushed down to part with what was then the princely sum of £12 in order to acquire mine. With its somewhat improbable dust jacket, it looks as though it is color-coded like a regimental tie, a series of stripes diagonally across the cover. At a stroke, Howard and Paret had shattered the illusion, carefully nurtured not just by his British critics, but even by Germans, that Clausewitz was obscure, contradictory, and hard to understand. Here was On War with a punch, both readable and comprehensible. Princeton University Press even managed to reduce its bulk, abandoning the 3-volume structure of the original German and the 3-volume structure which the Graham translation had emulated for a single volume. It was compact enough to go into the revised Everyman series when that started production, a copy of which a reporter found in an Al-Qaeda safe house in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. One of my current students at St Andrews, Connor Collins, did a Google Books Ngrain search to show references to Clausewitz in printed works in English. In English and in American English, those references peaked in the early 1980s. In Britain, that peak was twice on war's previous peaks. There had been one in each of the 2 world wars. In the United States, that peak had no significant precedent. It was 5 times greater than that in Britain. The Howard and Paret translation effected 2 major shifts in Anglo-Saxon strategic thought. In the United States, it ended the dominance of Clausewitz's contemporary Jomini, which had persisted since the mid-19th century, when it was translated into English, when the Précis de l'Art de la Guerre was translated into English for the first time, and was still to be found in legacy form even during the Cold War. And in the United Kingdom, it finally ended up the nonsense written about Clausewitz, particularly by Basil Littleheart. In The Ghost of Napoleon, published in 1933, Littleheart had lampooned Clausewitz as the Mahdi of the mass, had characterized his text as obscure and self-contradictory, and confusingly had even argued that Clausewitz believed war invariably trumped policy. Howard particularly relished his demolition of Littleheart, who had died 6 years previously. But his hatchet had a regrettable byproduct. Michael Howard was particularly interested in Clausewitz's influence on military thought, but he failed to notice how profoundly On War had shaped Julian Corbett's Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. This may have been because Michael Howard had little interest in naval matters, or it may have been because some of the ideas which Littleheart had branded as his own, particularly the British way in warfare, which Howard also criticized, were lifted unacknowledged from Corbett. Corbett had used Clausewitz to stress the relationship of war and policy, to distinguish between what Corbett called major strategy or grand strategy and minor strategy, and to show the relationship between major war and limited war, that war had a binary character. By reading Corbett through the lens of Littleheart, not Littleheart through the lens of Corbett, Howard contributed to a culture in Britain which concentrated so heavily on Littleheart and gave insufficient attention to Corbett. The sales of the 1976 edition of On War have comfortably exceeded those of any previous edition in any language, including German. Michael Howard used to cite figures of 200,000, and that was some time ago, and they must still be climbing. What particularly pleased Michael Howard in all this was that On War was being read by soldiers. Especially, it was being read in US war colleges. For Michael Howard, Clausewitz was a soldier writing for other soldiers. This was evident in the graphic way in which Clausewitz described combat, but it was also obvious in Clausewitz's attention to the issues of morale and friction. Apart from the edition of On War itself, Michael Howard wrote only 2 extended pieces on Clausewitz. The first was the introductory essay for the translation, which is on the influence of Clausewitz, a total of 17 pages. And the second is a short volume, 74 pages, on Clausewitz for Oxford University Press's Pastmaster series. The latter in particular is studied with aperçus which reflect the experience of the young Michael Howard as a junior officer in the Coldstream Guards between 1943 and 1945. He empathized with Clausewitz's observations on the military profession, on its resistance to learning, on the long periods of boredom in war, as well as the moments of intense terror. The second chapter of Michael Howard's Clausewitz is called The Theory and Practice of War. It is actually a chapter on practice, not theory, and in a sense is a dialogue between one soldier and another, which focuses above all on morale in war. But that band of shared experience then prompted in Michael Howard the same frustration with Clausewitz's methodology, which had been expressed by many other soldiers who have read on war, and at times makes Howard's comments on Clausewitz read in terms which are as tetchy as those of Little Hart. Howard stressed the elements of confusion in Clausewitz's thinking and the contradictions within the text. Although he acknowledged that Clausewitz's approach was dialectical, he never seemed fully to embrace the implications of the method. Its purpose was to set up propositions, to juxtapose thesis and antithesis, both of them based on historical evidence or on Clausewitz's own experience, so as to generate an understanding of war as a phenomenon. Raymond Aron had called his book on Clausewitz, also published in 1976, Penser la guerre, How to Think About War. But it's as though Howard wanted On War to be a book that was more practical than philosophical. He wanted to resolve the paradoxes through congruence. At the beginning of his short study of Clausewitz, Howard said that Clausewitz, and I'm quoting him, had limited his analysis to what would be of immediate utility to a commander planning a campaign. That makes Clausewitz sound very like Jomini. The third chapter of Howard's book on Clausewitz is called Ends and Means in War. Howard mentioned the dialectical method at the beginning, but then suppressed the tensions in order to develop a linear view of war shaped by the vocabulary of ends and means. He had already in the book summarized Clausewitz's view of war in ways which are inherently hierarchical, to quote Howard again on Clausewitz. Military maneuver was pointless unless it was designed to culminate in battle, and battle was pointless unless it was designed to serve the ultimate purpose of war. And so in the chapter on ends and means, Howard tells us that Clausewitz uses the verb Zweck, the German word, to describe the ultimate end of war, and the word Ziel to describe the intermediate objective of a subordinate military commander. And so he manages to create a hierarchy. The means, the Mittel of war, this intermediate objective, the Ziel, and then the ultimate objective of Zweck. The trouble is that Clausewitz did no such thing. What instead happens is that he uses different words at different times to convey different meanings. Sometimes zeal refers to the ultimate objective of war rather than Zweck, and vice versa. A source of particular frustration for Michael Howard was Book 3 of On War, that which is entitled Strategy in General. Howard dismissed it as only a collection of chapters on diverse topics linked by no very evident common theme. One might assume, he went on, that Clausewitz's interest in strategy was slight in comparison with his almost obsessive concern with what he saw as the main tool of the strategist, that is to say, battle. Clausewitz had indeed defined strategy as the use of the battle for the purposes of the war. But Howard neither cited that definition, despite the fact that it was one to which Clausewitz cleaved throughout his writings from 1804 onwards, nor was ready to accept that it was what Clausewitz believed strategy to be. He wanted Clausewitz to interpret strategy as the ordering of priorities. That was Michael Howard's phrase, the ordering of priorities, so that strategy would be a more hierarchical and also be given a more modern meaning than Clausewitz accorded it, one which reached its fulfillment, if you like, in policy in that hierarchy. And herein lay a second source of Howard's frustration with Clausewitz. He actually says very little about the idea that war is the continuation of policy by other means. He asserts it in Book 1, Chapter 1, and he develops the implications much more fully in Book 8 on war plans. But it is absent from Book 3 on strategy, and almost entirely so from all the other books. The significant exception to that generalization is its latency in Book 6, that on the defense. One of Michael Howard's significant contributions was his recognition of just how fundamental Book 6 was to the evolution of Clausewitz's thinking. The book forced Clausewitz not just to address the relationship between defense and attack, but also to embrace a wider view of war, a wider history of war that went beyond Clausewitz's own experience of the Napoleonic Wars, and ultimately to recognize the role of policy as a way of uniting the different forms which war might assume. Howard and Paret justified their treatment of On War by their constant reiteration of the point that the text was unfinished, save in relation to Book 1, Chapter 1. In other words, if you take this chapter in isolation, you can use it to iron out the differences, distinctions, paradoxes, and contradictions in what follows in order to produce an interpretation of both war and strategy that is less about dialectics and more about an aphoristic hierarchical relationship that runs from tactics or battle through strategy to war as a political instrument. If you follow that line too, you've also got much less of Clausewitz to read. The staff college student who has been only too pleased to know that all he needs to read is Book 1, Chapter 1, and not the whole text, has been endlessly grateful to Howard and Paret. The intellectual basis for this approach is one of two prefatory notes written by Clausewitz to von Krieger, and both published by his wife, Mary von Brühl, in the first edition of 1832. One of those prefatory notes is dated 10th of July, 1827, and it lays out Clausewitz's plans for revising the text as a whole. The other is undated, and it says that Clausewitz regarded only Book 1, Chapter 1 as finished. Howard and Paret dated this note to 1830, assuming it was written as Clausewitz packed up his papers before joining Gneisenau as his chief of staff in Poland as revolution threatened across Europe. Werner Halve, the great German scholar who had been at that conference in Berlin in 1964, dated this undated prefatory note, to 1827, and others, including Michael Howard's pupil Azar Gatt, have agreed with Halve. If this note was written in 1827, then Clausewitz did much more to revise the text than Howard ever acknowledged. Indeed, since 1976, the work of a number of scholars, preeminently Andreas Herberg-Rother, Anders Palmgren, and Paul Donker, has developed our understanding of the genesis of the text, first of all, by detecting afresh notes from Clausewitz himself that explain the evolution of his thinking, and secondly, by relating it to other publications of the 1820s on which Clausewitz drew, and thirdly, by linking the theoretical text of On War to the military histories which Clausewitz wrote in extenso throughout the period that in which he was developing his thinking. The result of all this work is that, if anything, we need to push back the maturation of Clausewitz's theoretical approaches to a period even earlier than 1827, certainly to 1825, and possibly before that. And what it does not do is confirm the notion that all comes to the great man very late, that it is only in 1830 that he realizes Book 1, Chapter 1 is finished. Peter Paret himself preempted this point by stressing the early formation of Clausewitz's thinking at the Kriegsakademie under Scharnhorst's direction, when Clausewitz, in his early 20s, regarded Scharnhorst effectively as his second father. It is then that his definition of strategy, which I've already quoted, is first formulated, and then too, he begins to sketch out the idea of the relationship between war and policy. But the effect of going back that far in Clausewitz's life is to produce another problem, which is to reduce the formative experiences on the maturer Clausewitz of the Jena campaign of 1806, when Prussia was smashed by Napoleon, of his service in Russia in 1812, and of the War of German Liberation between 1813 and 1815. Michael Howard, for his part, although he has stressed the importance of these years for Clausewitz the soldier, never paid much attention to their impact on Clausewitz's political thought. He specifically rejected the idea that Clausewitz had ever been a German nationalist, not least so that he could rebut the Nazis' appropriation of Clausewitz in the 1930s. But the circumstances of 1806 to 1815, of that period between Jena and Waterloo, did make Clausewitz a German nationalist. It is extraordinary that Michael Howard did not recognize this, given that he lectured on Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the philosopher whose speeches to the German nation delivered in 1808 so impressed Clausewitz. Between the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 and Napoleon's demand that Prussia supply a contingent for the invasion of Russia in February 1812, Clausewitz became increasingly frustrated with the reluctance of his king, Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, to confront the French. The effects radicalized him. He and Gneisenau looked with admiration at the insurgencies against French occupation and French rule emerging in Spain, Switzerland, and Italy. And in 1812, Clausewitz resigned his commission in the Prussian army to fight against it with the Russians. In that month, he penned a lengthy and angry confession of faith. It is addressed to the German nation over the head of the Prussian monarchy. In his writings, Michael Howard blamed the king's distrust of Clausewitz on the king himself. But here was an officer who ultimately put his faith in the nation over his loyalties to the crown if he had to choose between the two. The neglect of this phase in Clausewitz's life also led Howard to underestimate Clausewitz's contribution in another respect and overestimate it in a third respect. Let me deal with each of those in turn. Underestimation relates to Clausewitz's thinking on guerrilla and even revolutionary war. Howard read Clausewitz's interest in guerrilla warfare in terms of what he wrote in Book 6, Chapter 26 of On War. Here, guerrilla warfare is seen as supplementary to the main effort. But the end of the chapter talks about the nation continuing to fight after the, Howard and Paret actually translate the as a, after the major battle by means of a general insurrection. Clausewitz believed that it was important never to give up. This is what he had hoped for between 1807 and 1812, a national insurgency against the French occupiers. His lectures at the War Academy in those years addressed small wars. Their content reflects the conduct of so-called petty war in the 18th century. But when set alongside the private correspondence with Gneisenau, which plotted a national insurgency and the use of terror, they acquire a much wider significance. So important were these years to Clausewitz's intellectual, political, and emotional formation that some have argued that Clausewitz planned a second book on small war to go alongside that on war. And my colleague at St Andrews, Sibylla Scheipers, has gone further and seen in these developments the crucible of On War itself. After all, a national insurrection, as Clausewitz certainly recognized at the time, would have been a war without limits. Michael Howard did not address Clausewitz the insurgent. Instead, he stressed Clausewitz's emphasis on war's binary character. In the prefatory note of July 1827, the note that is dated, Clausewitz said war would be of two kinds. First of all, war could be a war of annihilation, to overthrow the enemy and to dictate to that defeated enemy a peace settlement. Secondly, it could be a war for more limited objectives, which ended in negotiation. Michael Howard recognized rightly that the second form of war is underrepresented in On War. Indeed, On War lampooned 18th century styles of limited warfare precisely because they were limited. It took the writing of Book 6 on defense, which had to use Frederick the Great more than Napoleon as its historical exemplar, for Clausewitz to appreciate that any universal theory of war had also to accommodate wars which were not fought with the intensity that had characterized warfare of the era of the French Revolution. And indeed, the sort of wars which he, Clausewitz, had personally experienced. Both types of war, in Michael Howard's typology of Clausewitz's thinking, were the result of political choice. The idea that war was the continuation of policy by other means could accommodate both major and limited war, and so provides an overarching framework for all wars. Howard's overestimation of Clausewitz's contribution was the result of his determination to relate this binary model of war to the conditions of the Cold War. Clausewitz dealt with the scale of major war in three ways. First of all, in Book 1, Chapter 1, he posits an ideal type, that of absolute war, which he says can never be achieved in reality. Secondly, in Book 8, he modifies that view by saying that actually absolute war does sometimes happen, and it did so under the impact of revolutionary France. And thirdly, Clausewitz also introduces the notion of eine ganze Krieg, a whole war, entire in itself, which escalates because that is what is in war's nature. Michael Howard tended to lump all these three together under the title Total War, so introducing a 20th century concept which Clausewitz had not used and of course with which he was not directly familiar. And is so he appropriated Clausewitz's ideas to encapsulate not just the experience of the Second World War, in which of course he served himself, but the threat of nuclear war. The consequence of this for Clausewitz's reputation, however, was that there was a danger, and showing if Clausewitz was the prophet of total war, then Clausewitz was also nothing more than what Little Hearted City was, which was a German militarist. So Michael Howard then had to elevate the role of limited war thinking in Clausewitz's calculations to offset this notion of total war. Howard confessed that apart from the prefatory note, not much in On War addressed the notion of limited war. Because Clausewitz saw war's propensity for escalation, Howard stressed the importance of political control in containing it. The Korean War, particularly in Michael Howard's introduction to the influence of On War in the translation, the Korean War became the pivot for this argument. The Korean War did not become a limited war because Clausewitz had said there was such a thing as limited war, obviously not. But Clausewitz's theory provided a retrospective analysis as to why it could be so construed. Michael Howard followed Osgood in seeing Clausewitz as a theorist who could bestow utility on war in an era when nuclear war ruled out major war. It was quite a stretch from the text of On War, albeit a sustainable one. After all, even before the outbreak of the First World War, before 1914, both Hans Delbrück, the founding father of military history, academic military history, and certainly academic military history in Germany, and Julian Corbett, the author of some principles of maritime strategy, had used Clausewitz's 1827 note to make exactly the same point, to point out the binary nature of war and that war could be limited. It did not have to be major war. But Michael Howard used the Korean War to make a further point and to argue that Clausewitz was also a theorist of civil-military relations, who recognized the need to subordinate the military to the political. The trouble was that Clausewitz's own behavior in 1812 had more clearly matched that of Douglas MacArthur in asserting the authority of the military over the political. Howard and Paret make great play of the fact that their edition of On War was the first in English to be on the first German edition of 1832 to 34. They acknowledged that there were good reasons why both Graham, Clausewitz's translator in 1873, and then Jolles, who had translated in a much more literal and closer to the German fashion On War in 1943, had used the second edition. That was because the first edition had contained significant corruptions and misprints which needed correction and which were subsequently corrected. However, when it came to the role of the military commander in the decisions of the cabinet, an issue which is discussed in Book 8 of On War, Howard and Paret stuck with the first edition's text in their translation, which said, as they put it in their rendering, that the commander-in-chief should be in the cabinet so that his military decisions will be fully consonant with the state's policy. It is important at this juncture to remind ourselves, as the Howard and Paret edition, I have to say, did not, that the cabinet in question was not a modern cabinet the cabinet of the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but the private office of the King, a body to which Clausewitz in his history of the Jena campaign of 1806 attributed much of the fault for that catastrophe. Howard and Paret insisted that the first edition reflected Clausewitz's intentions, which were to enable the cabinet to take a part in the commander's decisions, not to enable the commander to take an active part in the cabinet's decisions. The second edition, Michael Howard suggested, opened the door to an overmighty military which would participate in all political decisions. The trouble with this interpretation is that Clausewitz never drew such a clear demarcation between and the military. In Book 8 of On War, Clausewitz goes out of his way to address the need for policy to be shaped by what is militarily possible, recognizing the dangers that would arise if a statesman asked war to achieve something of which war was not capable. And Clausewitz, as a consequence of this, was emphatic that the commander-in-chief needed to be both a soldier and a statesman. Howard wanted Clausewitz to be addressing the civil-military relationships of liberal democracy in the late 20th century, when in fact he was confronting those of a weak monarch who nonetheless still believed in absolutism. Since the 1990s, particular attention has focused on the Trinity, that brief discussion at the end of Book 1, Chapter 1, which had previously been neglected by many commentators, but which after 1976, not least because of Howard and Paret's attention to and focus on Book 1, Chapter 1, but also because of Raymond Aron's book, Penser la guerre, received much more attention. Since the end of the Cold War, it is this passage which in particular has generated criticisms of Clausewitz from contemporary commentators. And they do so because, in part, of the way in which they have elected to read that text. In that text, Clausewitz addresses, first of all, what he calls the primary, or what has come to be called the primary trinity in war. That is to say, the passion that it involves, the role of the play of probability and chance within it, and the function of reason. And Clausewitz then goes on to suggest that these relationships are best embodied, the relationship between those three factors, in the people in terms of passion, the armed forces in terms of the play of probability and chance, and the government in terms of reason. But he then goes on to say these relationships are not fixed. And indeed, the relationship between each of them is like magnets alternately repelling and attracting one another. And there is certainly no suggestion within them that policy is dominant. It is therefore particularly unfortunate when this second interpretation has been used to criticize Clausewitz as overly preoccupied with war as an instrument of the state, that Michael Howard himself colluded in that interpretation. He wanted Clausewitz to be addressing the civil-military relationship with which he was familiar. And in a lecture given at Oxford in 1984, Michael Howard described the Trinity, that brief passage, in the following terms. Clausewitz described war as being compounded of a paradoxical, that was the word he used in the translation, Trinity. The government for which it was an instrument of policy, the military for which it was the exercise of skill, and the people as a whole, the extent of whose involvement determined the intensity with which the war would be raised. His footnote refers to his own translation of On War, but the reading which he has imposed on that text is one, as I've already suggested, which is open to, is only one of a number of possible readings. Moreover, in its focus on the government, the armed forces, and the people, it elevates the actors of the so-called secondary trinity over these qualities which are at the heart of the primary trinity. Michael Howard was both a Grotian and a Hobbesian. His reaction to the Geneva Convention of the additional protocols of 1977 to the Geneva Convention, which recognized the legal rights of freedom fighters, so-called, and his frustration at the United States' global war on terror in response to the 9/11 attacks in 2001, showed a man who believed that the state had to ensure its monopoly of war in order to control it, and who saw policy as a mechanism to limit it. Hugo Grotius' development of international law in 1625, De Jure Belli et Pacis, and Thomas Hobbes' Commonwealth in 1651, developed, of course, in the Leviathan, provided the framework for Howard of a rational order for war, which could shape its utility and control its penchant for escalation. In the era of the Cold War, that was a wise, prudent, and humane approach to war, both realistic in its recognition of war's possibility and ambitious in its hope that it could be contained. But it was not the war which Clausewitz had addressed. Michael Howard was the founding father in post-1945 Britain of both academic military history and the nascent discipline of strategic studies. He believed, as Clausewitz did, that the former was a key component, possibly the key component of the latter. But in Clausewitz himself, he found a subject where too often the requirements of the first were at odds with the contemporary pressures of the second, where history and strategic studies were in collision rather than in collusion. In seeking to make Clausewitz relevant for the late 20th century, he could on occasion underestimate the influences of the early 19th century. However, those very influences were to give Clausewitz a purchase on the developments of the early 21st century in ways that the Howard interpretation underestimated. Like any translation, the 1976 edition of On War was reflective of its times. None of us, historians or students of strategy, is immune to those pressures, nor should we be. The point here is not to criticize Michael Howard, but to criticize those who have mistaken his extrapolations from On War for the nuance and variety of von Kriege. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Sir Hew, for that. And I'm going to enjoy listening to that all over again tomorrow, and I'm going to pick out and polish those gems. Could I abuse the chair's privilege here and just get the Q&A rolling? Your observations about strategic culture and which strategic thinkers appealed to which countries really fascinates me, because I noticed this when I worked at the US Naval War College. Really the first exposure that I'd had to Julian Corbett's work was in the States. And I found this fascinating, given that the Americans, especially the US Navy, emphasized muscle power, a large fleet, and yet Corbett emphasized sort of peripheral approaches and how you don't need to control all the ocean in order to have an impact. Why do you think that Britain was dismissive of people like Julian Corbett and perhaps a little slow on the uptake when it comes to Clausewitz? Thank you.
I'm finding it very strange that, I mean, Michael Howard's own engagement with Corbett in relation to Clausewitz is literally 2 lines that I can find, and it misses the main point. It is odd. I think part of Corbett's problem, of course, is that he had published in 1911, immediately before the First World War. Andrew Lambert, of course, is working on Corbett, does have strong views on this. I mean, the Corbett is still there, alive and kicking during the First World War, but Britain, of course, does not adopt a maritime strategy, even if Sir Edward Grey suggests that Britain should on the 3rd of August 1914. And after that, I think in many respects, although Britain thought about a maritime strategy in 1939 as well, and still anticipated using blockade in 1939 or economic warfare in 1939, and Little Heart, of course, was in part responsible for keeping that particular light aflame. It did not seem the right approach in 1939 either, and indeed its very association with Little Heart was one of the things that would tend to rubbish it, because Little Heart was, of course, asking for a limited liability before 1939, and then negotiation with Hitler by 1941. So there is here a real difficulty, and it's only recently it seems to me that people have gone back to Corbett, who is, possibly the most original of British strategic thinkers. So I think context is all, and certainly in the 1980s, when Michael Howard was writing the Continental Commitment, was attacking, so he was writing the Continental Commitment earlier, but with the Continental Commitment out, Paul Kennedy writing The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery, couched in very similar terms, but addressing sea power to Michael. And of course, Paul's representative sea power is not Corbett, but Mahan. So there are all sorts of ways why, despite the fact there's a book on British Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery. So I think there are a number of factors here which contribute. But also, in the end, we pick up those strategic thinkers, I suppose what this reflects, who capture the mood of the moment. Why does Clausewitz, that of course is what Michael Howard did for Clausewitz. He made him work for the mood of the moment, which is precisely why he became so widely read. That is the big achievement, and I'm not for a moment underestimating that. So I think there is a moment of pacing here, which is central.
Thank you, Sir Hew. It dovetails very nicely with one of the incoming questions. We've got a question from Olivia Garrard. Given the influence that nuclear weapons had on the nature of their translation of Clausewitz, as well as the liberties they took, are we ripe for a new translation, do you think?
An American friend said to me, "How about we do a new translation?" and I said, "My life's certainly now my life's too short." We are ripe for. I think we are ripe for a new translation. I think the challenge is enormous, and this, of course, is where again I have to doff my cap to Howard and Paret. I mean, if you read the Jolly's translation, the 1943 one. Which is it is a very literal translation of the second edition Czech text. It actually gets you much closer to Clausewitz in the German if you have no German. But it's not just how do you get close to the German and retain fluency, which Jolly struggles to do, and which of course Howard and Paret achieved. It's also that a new edition actually requires proper textual annotation, which Halveg began to give to the German edition, but requires even more. I was trained as a classicist at school, and when you read Thucydides or when you read Tacitus or whatever, there was a scholarly apparatus to the text which explained the influences, which explained the references. There is none of that in Clausewitz. So you don't even have the military history references properly explained unless you know them. And even more, we don't have an edition which explains where Clausewitz has lifted unacknowledged ideas from other thinkers, his immediate contemporaries. He acknowledges Machiavelli, or he acknowledges Jomini to abuse him, or Bülow to abuse him, but he doesn't. There are moments when he's effectively using both Bülow and Jomini directly, and certainly Guibert and Barenhorst and others of his contemporaries, very often word for word. Without reference, and all that needs explaining. So a scholarly edition in German would be a start, as I was suggesting, and it needs to be related, of course, to all Clausewitz's other writings, because that's where he's hammering out these ideas. So we absolutely do need a good scholarly edition of Clausewitz. but it probably has to be in German before we even begin the English one.
Speaking as somebody who forced herself to learn German in order to do her PhD thesis, I appreciate the challenges. Many thanks for that. A very good question from Sean Minton about the translation, about continuation of policy by other means. Sorry, somebody's just come in and overwritten that. Let me try that again. Sean asks, many thanks for your talk. What would you say to the asserted error in the Howard Paret translation by James Holmes in The Diplomat, where he claims that Howard and Paret incorrectly translated the German to the continuation of policy by other means, when it should be the continuation of policy with other means? And how correct is that assertion? That's a fairly familiar debate, I think.
Yes, it is. And of course, the answer is that, as ever, there is ambiguity in these things. I need to go back and remind myself now of what the precise German is. But you know, clearly, if you look at the text elsewhere, where Clausewitz describes policy as an alien element within war, as sometimes acting as an alien element, particularly if policy is trying to dampen down a war which is escalating, or alternatively, policy wants to escalate war when it's going in the other direction. Absolutely, policy is, in that sense, understood by Clausewitz as being alien in relation to war itself. War itself has this capacity to dominate policy, and therefore become the end, if you like, rather than just the means. So I think the point of the reference is to understand that this relationship is nothing like as clearly fixed as late 20th century readings of, particularly in English, of On War made it. So yes, I would accept that. And of course, critically, I mean, you know, the question of whether you translate policy as policy or politics. I mean, it seems to me self-evident that what Clausewitz is talking about, the politique, he means policy, partly because when he does address the issue of politics in his account of the 1815 campaign, he then does deal with partisan politics, and he's using different vocabulary to do that than politique. So I think anybody who translates war as the continuation of politics by other means, again, is glossing the text in terms which with an ambiguity, in that particular case, although politique is ambiguous today in its translation, it seems to me clear what Clausewitz intended.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is a very good one, I think, from Robert Levine. Can you discuss how Clausewitz addressed the issue of war termination, and do you think the Howard and Paret version deal with it in the way that perhaps needed to be done?
Well, of course, you know, the person who really addressed what Clausewitz might have said about war termination was Raymond Aron when he wrote Penser la guerre. I mean, he took the text in much more benign and positive ways. Clausewitz says, it seems to me Clausewitz Michael Howard was clear that Clausewitz belonged, and I am simplifying him, but it was clear that Clausewitz belonged with those who believed that a decisive battle would end the campaign. Part of the difficulty here is, of course, what Clausewitz is so often addressing is not the whole gamut of 1792 to 1815. He is dealing with individual, which is why Howard and Paret want to translate Krieg as campaign so often. He's dealing with individual campaigns within the Napoleonic Wars. And in a way that was entirely logical for a Prussian, because after all, Prussia stopped fighting in 1795 and didn't fight again till 1806. These were separate wars, the wars of the First Coalition and the War of 1806. So these were self-contained conflicts. And the 1806 war absolutely ended with there's a pursuit after the battle, and Clausewitz is clear that that termination is what ends it. But of course, he says very little about peace. I mean, he does say, Clausewitz, Littleheart didn't give him the credit for this, but he does say the object ultimately, at one point, is peace, that it is what we should be trying to achieve as quality of war. And he does talk in terms of balance of power theory, reflecting the thinkings of Gens and others of his own time, that this is what you should be trying to achieve in order to get some sort of stability within Europe. But war termination, in the sense in which it's understood now, is underdeveloped. And so, of course, as with other things, you're having to gloss the text in order to say what you want it to say, which is what Aron, above all, was doing in 1976, more than Howard and Paret.
There's an interesting question about the influence, not just of Clausewitz, but the sort of German general staff system. You know, there was a certain amount of seduction of that and influence on the British military from the late 19th century onwards. Any thoughts on that?
Well, is this the attraction of Clausewitz? I mean, we normally see self-evidently that with the Graham translation coming out in 1873, so right after the Franco-Prussian War, right after the time when Prussia's put its stamp on Europe and Germany has been unified, and the Prussian army is seen to be the embodiment of what a modern army should be, that is the moment when Clausewitz is read. So there is a relationship here. And of course, it was that very influence that Littleheart was focused on trying to deny. I mean, he said, the problem is we've become too Prussian. And during the First World War, that was a recurrent complaint. There's no point in trying to beat a Prussianized Germany in a First World War if we ourselves become like Prussia. If we end up having a mass army, conscription, a dominant general staff, then we've ceased to be a liberal democracy in the sense in which we would understand it. I mean, that was absolutely where Littleheart is coming from. And of course, it's a fair warning. It is, there is a danger here. On the other hand, there is the issue of the necessity of war, and you might need to create a mass army, and you might need to create a powerful general staff. You certainly need an effective planning body if you're going to fight 20th century warfare. So you're going to have to do some things the Prussians have done, which Britain hasn't really had to confront, precisely because of its island status and sea power hitherto. So I think, is it the case? I mean, what's interesting, of course, and paradoxical since 1945, is that although the study of Clausewitz in Germany has not gone away, and although Clausewitz has been welcomed as the honorary liberal now, in the way that he was also welcomed as a Nazi in the 1930s, although that has happened, Clausewitz is far more widely read in the English-speaking world than he is in the German-speaking world today. And that is partly a reflection of the state of strategic studies in Germany and its flourishing state, or comparatively flourishing state. I know we always moan that it could be bigger, better and bigger in the English-speaking world.
Thank you. A very good question. What do you think is the most dangerous reading or selective use of Clausewitz in security studies? That would require the rest of the evening to answer.
Well, I'm going to touch the bullet. I'm going to say that the most dangerous thing.
We talk about political leaders. We talk about soldiers, about peacekeepers, which for the most.
I'm going to say the most dangerous thing is selective reading, full stop. The danger always with Clausewitz is precisely as you were saying in your introduction. You read him again and you find something fresh. I mean, it is extraordinary how he has that capacity. And he has that capacity because here is an inquiring mind who is constantly asking questions of his own assumptions. That it is that internal debate on the page, which is what makes him so full of insight. And it is precisely the danger of selective reading, whichever it is. Even the, war, war is the continuation of policy by the means is probably the most dangerous of the lot, because that is the most fashionable. If you see the adjective Clausewitzian in any contemporary comment, not that it happens much now, but because other vocabulary is taken over, but in the 80s, after the impact of the Howard and Paret translation was being felt, journalists would use this. And what they meant was war is the continuation of policy by other means. But what, of course, they lost sight of, which Clausewitz was absolutely clear about, is war is a very different state. It's not a continuation. And particularly for a liberal democracy, it's a radical change in pace. So it is dangerous purely because it is so seductive. I mean, Little Hart would have given you a very different answer, because he would focus on all the strong vocabulary about major war and battle and bloodthirstiness and violence within war, which is there, saying, this is what's dangerous. But we sort of take that for granted. We know, we understand that. We don't need to be preached to about that. And so it's actually the things that appeal to us as early 21st century small L liberals, which are the more dangerous, because we read them selectively as we wish to read them.
Yeah, one respondent, this made me smile, who in essence is asking, who is a new Clausewitz in your mind? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about where strategic thinking is going today?
Well, I think at one level, strategic thinking is in a very healthy state, precisely because we recognize a great, so widely recognized as being necessary. And although I think it went through a period of confusion when, at the end of the Cold War and the decline of nuclear deterrence, because so much attention had been given to that dimension of the question, it has gained undoubtedly fresh impetus since the beginning of the 21st century, and I think it is in a comparatively healthy state. But is it actually going to achieve the focus that Clausewitz did on strategy as a way of understanding war? No, I don't think it can, because actually we see it as much more having to address the issues of war and peace, and that will diffuse the focus. And secondly, we live in an era where we are constantly told that the pace of change is endlessly increasing, a sort of cliche which I resist because I don't think it helps us very much, quite frankly. But the pace of technological change in the 20th and then the 21st century has meant that Clausewitz, who's really not concerned with technology at all because he was living in an era of comparatively unchanging technology, he was concerned with social and political change because of the impact of the French Revolution. But because he doesn't address technological change, he is free to think of strategy and war in the realm of ideas. The challenge for us always is, if you produce a discussion of strategy which looks at war in a philosophical and more abstract sense, is that those who believe that a new wonder weapon is going to affect dramatic change, or those who believe that cyber war is going to fundamentally change the nature of war, these sort of things actually then get in the way of a proper analysis. I mean, not that you should be deterred. After all, Clausewitz, like Corbett, was neglected. Both of them had a bad track record in getting leverage in the immediate aftermath of publication. The fact you're not recognized in your own lifetime should not be a deterrent. I mean, the danger is, if you're an academic, you need to be recognized according to the ref cycle, not according to posterity 50 years on, which would do for Clausewitz. And the danger, if you're serving, is that no armed forces today are going to give you the leisure of 10 years and plus, which is what the Prussian army gave Clausewitz, to sit down and write on war. That will be the day.
Yeah, thank you. One respondent has posed the very interesting question, I think, how has your thinking about strategy changed over the years? Have you found your views morphing?
I do. I hope my ideas are morphing. I would certainly be very worried if they were static. I think I have what I think. Golly, I've got to collect my thoughts for this one. When I read Howard and Paret in 1976, I thought this was it, and I self-evidently from what I said now, it still informs my thinking. Clausewitz certainly still informs my thinking, but I don't think this is it any longer. I think I will still find insights and richness in Clausewitz, but I don't think this is it. But why my admiration for Clausewitz increases is that many of the things I would now think is important, like, where do we fit in non-state actors? How do we fit in the notion of insurgency, revolution, and so on? Clausewitz is good on all these things, just not so good on war. It's in his other writings that he's good. And I think the other issue is, by training, I'm a military historian. I'm not a strategic studies man. If we're talking about disciplinary background, I didn't read politics. I read history at Cambridge. That is my discipline, which of course is, why I entirely empathize with Michael Howard and Peter Paret, because that was their discipline. They were not, that was the subject from which they came. And crucially, of all the disciplines that shaped Clausewitz, history was the dominant one. I mean, he looked at many other subjects, mathematics, engineering, and so on, in order to get a grasp on some of the metaphors and ways in which you would understand strategy. And the challenge today is that, of course, strategic studies draws on many more disciplines than history, and in sometimes can be actually, for my money, of course, too distant from history. The point here about history is that history, I'm going slightly off the tangent, but history teaches us about understanding change. I mean, people see the study of history as somehow about continuity. That's not true. It's simply, why do we prioritize the French Revolution or the outbreak of the First World War or 9/11? We prioritize the things that actually have a dramatic effect in terms of how we behave and think. And of course, we understand history because we need history to help us understand. So we get context and purchase on those big events. But we also need to recognize how much they can change our thinking. And I therefore actually resist notions, which of course are fashionable in strategic studies today, and I've debated these issues with others, particularly Colin Gray, but this notion that strategy is somehow unchanging. I mean, I just don't see that, because actually strategy is constantly presented with change. The principles are not, and simply to say, well, war is a constant. And then people cite Clausewitz, the nature of war is constant, the character of war changes. Colin Gray particularly was keen on that. And there's some truth in that, but you can only take the argument so far. I mean, war may have enduring features, including its reciprocity and the element of danger and violence within it, all that, the importance of morale, friction, I mean, things Clausewitz stresses. But at the same time, the whole point about the argument about technology, political change, and so on, is that war is also changing in response to those circumstances. And you cannot simply look at the continuities in their own right. For a historian to argue that history is about continuity and change is hardly the most original or earth-shattering observation, but that's really where I would come at it from. I've verged a long way from whether my own views of strategic studies have changed. Well, the short answer is it gets harder as you get older, as everybody knows, to change your views, but I certainly hope they continue to change. And I used to think were wrong a decade ago. I now accept are very important. I used to be doubtful about the impact of climate change on strategy. I'm now deeply impressed not because climate change itself affects strategy, but simply because climate change will affect political behavior. And therefore, it's a very important factor for us to consider. It will affect state behavior. It will affect how we look at the balance and allocation of resources. It will affect pressures for autarky, free trade, and so on. So one has to absorb change.
That's a neat segue into the next question, which I've been dying to ask you for years, actually, about the state of history as a discipline. I went through cycles, talking about cycles of up and down. I was rather pessimistic until comparatively recently. What's your take on the profession?
It's very different from when Michael Howard and his generation were thinking about it. And I think what in particular has happened has been that historians are increasingly talking to themselves. I do think one of the problems if you think of people like Michael Howard, Hugh Trevor-Roper, Alan Taylor, a generation of historians who saw a responsibility that flowed from the engagement with history to engage in a public debate, to have something to say. And of course, there are plenty of historians who do engage in public debate still. I'm not saying that they don't. But they don't seem to me to have quite the leverage or the range that was the case then. And history as a profession tends to denigrate them. And of course, if they're being sloppy historians, that's entirely right. But the danger here is that as we pursue in true spirit of academic research, true, genuine scholarly work, we need also to think, to whom are we addressing this scholarly work? Where is it actually finding its reach? And I don't think we historians ask themselves that question often enough. Fashion as ever has a powerful effect. So there are certain, I certainly don't bemoan the state of military history. Military history is stronger in this country than it's ever been, quite frankly, in terms of its support from within universities, because the universities have responded to where the custom is, and military history is a popular and attractive subject, and therefore it's light years away from when I began my career, and that's not least thanks to Michael Howard, of course, who helped make it an academically legitimate subject. So there are ups and downs, I suppose, is my response to that. But I would like to see both, as many would, a greater historical understanding, a sense of the past in Britain, because we don't seem to have that sense of the past, except in a sort of, Johnsonian, Churchillian sense, which is not actually terribly helpful. We don't seem to have a true and sophisticated understanding of the past. And we deal with other countries that have a very clear sense of their own past, which we both underestimate and are not qualified to challenge.
There have been several questions about, what would Clausewitz think of this, as I put it, obsession with a fifth domain and cyber. And that's one of the reasons why the sort of Clausewitz quote about be careful how you think about the nature of warfare, because if you blunt your sword too much, somebody's going to come up and hack off your arms. So it's a problematic area, but I think Clausewitz did recognize that there were more things going on, not least insurgencies and sort of existential threats challenging us. But what's your view about, as I put it, the obsession with cyber at the expense of other, traditional war fighting means?
Well, for me, because this is where Clausewitz's influence is going to come out, but for me, war involves both reciprocity and violence. It involves killing, and cyber, therefore, to talk about cyber threats in terms of hostile threats in cyberspace, which may have repercussions short of war, is not the same as talking about cyber war. And cyber war itself seems to me a phrase which to Clausewitz would be meaningless, because he would certainly understand, I assume, the role of cyber as an ancillary instrument in the waging of war. He would certainly understand that cyber is now central to communications, intelligence collection, all those things, as an enabler. And therefore there will be conflict in cyberspace if there is war, precisely because it is a vital enabler. And if you're going to get inside the mind of the enemy or the enemy's command cycle or the enemy's strategic planning or any of these things, cyber will be central. But let's not confuse a cyber attack in an election with war. It's not war. It may be a hostile act, but it's no more hostile than inserting stories in other people's newspapers during the First World War, which Britain was very good at doing. That is not, trying to influence opinion, both in war and peace in other countries, is not, the important thing is to be aware of it, indeed. I mean, and that's, we're inflating the issue in order to make ourselves aware of it. And that's entirely right. I mean, we need to be aware of it. We need to be sensitive to what is influencing and shaping our opinions. But let's not call war things that aren't war.
Yeah, good point. I'm just conscious of time's winged chariot, and we've really only got a few more minutes, and you've been speaking for much longer than we could have wished for, really. But a number of respondents have spoken about what you feel were the most significant influences on both Clausewitz and Sir Michael's thinking in terms of educational background. And this is really interesting because both of them at various times do loose off about the lack of intellectual curiosity among their cadre. And that to me is one of the most interesting questions which you touched on in relation to both of them. So thank you.
Yeah. They had that common influence, which was serving in war as young men. I mean, I do think, for it's not an intellectual influence, but a formative influence. That right from childhood to adulthood, or from adolescence to adulthood. I mean, in Clausewitz's case, almost childhood, because he's 12 years old when 1792, when the War of the First Coalition begins, so I think that rite of passage, and this is sort of very personal, anecdotal, but when my father was at Cambridge just to complete his first year when the war broke out, Second World War broke out, and I realized just how powerful the experience of the Second World War was for him and his generation, precisely because when they came back from that, they were men. And of course, many of their friends had been killed and all that sort of thing. And I think that was absolutely true for Michael Howard and Clausewitz. So I don't think we should underestimate the formative influence of war on young men. I mean, that's one thing. Intellectually, what's, I suppose, interesting here is that I'm tempted to say, well, I think I'd be right in saying the influence on Clausewitz is an autodidact. I mean, he's a man who realizes he's not well read because he's joined the army at such a young age, and then takes the moment when he can get access to a decent library to educate himself, which means it's one of the reasons why he reads so interestingly and variously, because he's hoovering ideas up from all different directions. Scharnhorst gives him direction by saying, your experience is not enough. You need to read military history as well, because only thus will you be able to garner other experiences. But the autodidact means, of course, he also, it doesn't go down the lines that somebody taught in a specific discipline would adopt. And I'm tempted to say of Michael Howard too, that although absolutely he went up to Oxford to read history, and although he became a historian, I suspect if he'd done that in a conventional way, i.e. had a 3-year degree completed in the normal circumstances rather than circumstances of war, and had then not had the military experience, he would have become, in his ideal view, probably a standard Oxford Don, probably become an early modernist rather than a late modernist, and not gone down the route that he would have done. In other words, it's the other influences that change it. Having said that, he is enough of a scholar to respond to a text like Clausewitz. I mean, editing a text and translating a text is, as he said in his own memoirs, a deeply scholarly activity. And clearly, it was the moment, it seems to me, because after all, he'd never done a PhD or a DPhil. I mean, this is, he didn't follow the any more than any other budding academic of his generation. He didn't follow the standard academic cursus honorum. He'd never had a research fellowship. Any of the things that you would now see as normal for the academic was not where he had gone. So he's not of that generation of academics who are established before 1939, who therefore don't necessarily go off to the war in the sense of joining the army or the Navy or the Air Force, but go off to war perhaps in working for the Foreign Office or in a government department. I mean, they're doing war work, but they're doing a different sort of war work. Nor did he end up doing what many of the more academic ones did, which was things like going to SOE or into some forms of intelligence work or whatever. I mean, he actually is an infantry officer. A dangerous thing to be, but crucially important, it seems to me, for his formation. Yeah, I mean, it's. But in the end, he's teaching himself. He describes that process. People aren't guiding him, because once he's at King's and doing war studies, then he's having to actually grapple with what this subject is, because he's not very sure.
Bless you, thank you. I've just had a flood of thanks from people listening in, and I'm conscious that we're about to turn into pumpkins. It's the sort of datum point. So it just remains for me to thank you so much. You've been speaking for a long time, so we must let you off the hook. But it's tremendous. I've had a lot of people asking, is there a transcript of the Q&A session? And we'll piece together some of the questions that have come in, and perhaps feed you some emails as supplements. But bless you, thank you so much for your time. It has been, such an uplift in this dreadful COVID age when we're all feeling a bit closeted, but that was really uplifting. So thank you on behalf of the Sir Michael Howard Centre and literally hundreds of people listening in. Thank you so much for your time, Sir Hew.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for fielding all those questions on my behalf and putting them into rational shape, which I'm sure cannot have been easy. It's been a pleasure, and it's also an honor, of course, to remember Michael Howard at this juncture when we're a year on. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.